Ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, everyone. It is wonderful to see you here. We will have a fantastic, exciting day in Rome with a full-packed program today. And I'm going to deliver two news. One bad news for you, and that is that Professor Gustavo Piga has decided to delegate the role of a moderator to me. And to fill Gustavo's shoes is, as you know, not the easiest task. But I will try to do my best. The good news is that I'm not going to sing, so you can be very relaxed in that respect. I would like to start the morning with saying on behalf of us all to Torvegata, to Annalisa, to Gustavo, and everyone who arranged for last night's dinner. I think it was a wonderful event, and I think we should give them a big applause to thank you for that. Now, we have dispensed of the academic 30 minutes this morning, so we are slightly behind the schedule, so we will do whatever we can to try to catch up. I think that we will be a little bit late with the coffee break, probably 10 minutes. We will allow for a few questions, but probably shorten the question section after our first two presentations. We have very interesting agenda today, interesting topics. We have start with gender in procurement, then we have sustainable development and procurement, and we follow on with human rights and procurement. Very interesting topics and very important topics from a national perspective, but also topics which, from MDB's point of view, has been a bit of a challenge to grapple with over the years because of the way our policies work and the reason for our financing. But it's very important topics. I'm very pleased that we can address these today from eminent speakers. And the first speaker we have in the morning is my good friend and colleague, Philip Martin from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And I am going to read a few lines from his if we call it CV. Philip Martin has a background which includes working with the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, where he worked in Indonesia and Vietnam, and with the UN Office for Project Services, UNOPS, in Myanmar. He's also worked in the global headquarters of UNOPS in Denmark. He is a doctor, PhD in social anthropology and gender studies and this degree is from his native country, Australia. Then we are going to follow up that presentation with a presentation from Martin Burgi, who is a professor of public and European law at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. He is also director of Public and European Law Research Center for Public Procurement, Law and Administration Corporations. I hope I got that right. It's a long sentence, yeah. He's also a director of the Public Procurement Research Institute, and we are looking forward to your presentation also, Martin. Yeah. So, if I may invite Philip. You have about 25-30 minutes, and we are looking forward to listen to your presentation. Thank you.
I just realised the optics of a panel of men talking about gender procurement, so excuse our impertinence, but it's, I guess, a positive reflection on how far the debate has come in recent years, that there are groups of men active and participant in this really important area of procurement going forward. I'm going to start today with a conundrum. As leading procurement practitioners, experts, academics, thinkers in the room, what would you do if you found that large numbers of potential partners just weren't participating in your tendering and bidding processes? Not because of debarment, as discussed yesterday, not because bad process management has been in place or a poor application of procurement standards and principles. On the contrary, you scrupulously apply fair and open-minded competition for the businesses. Risks such as fraud and collusion are routinely minimised, and your tenders are attracting many bids. As a result, your buyers regularly receive goods, services or works at the best possible price from those submitted, and by most accounts, best value for money is achieved. But women just aren't showing up. They are not among the owners of the businesses that win the contracts. They are in a minority in management and decision-making positions on both buy and supply sides. Some of us in the room may think that one has got nothing to do with the other. And so long as procurement principles are upheld, fair and open competition is therefore facilitated. The procurement principles and processes are anyway gender neutral, and you wouldn't know whether women or men own the companies that win the bids, where women work, or what they do in the companies. It's not up to you. By doing nothing, we are more or less doing enough. Of course, there's the option to prioritise equity over efficiency. There's actions such as preferential marking, quotas for women, affirmative action, but these fundamentally present a betrayal of basic market principles. They distort the market. But what if I told you that we may have it exactly around the wrong way? That the market is already distorted. That after generations of gender discrimination, men and women experience and have come to expect different standards of accountability and transparency. That many women have come to distrust competition and have different beliefs now about fairness. That competition is gendered. In today's talk, I'm going to suggest that we in procurement are caught in a tension between a fantasy of the perfect market, a world in which gender doesn't map onto anything, and a real market where it maps onto everything. More, I'm going to suggest that to uphold the principles and standards of free and fair competition, we are obliged to consider how gender and competition intersect and respond to the factors that influence who enters the gender-neutral procurement system and who does not. Until fairly recently, people who tried to take seriously the political economy of gender equality were feeling a bit out of fashion. During the 20th and early 21st centuries, there were, of course, many breakthrough achievements for women's equality. Some women got the right to work, some women got the right to vote, some women got the right to own land, work and study in new areas, get divorces, etc. Throughout this period, however, and across the world, women remained socially and economically disadvantaged compared to men, in sometimes similar forms across time and generation. And this was broadly true for East and West, North and South, centrally planned and free market or market-oriented economies. Now, of course, the degrees differed widely of disadvantage, but nowhere did it ever flip. Moreover, as the new century dawned, some of us interested in the political economy of gender equality were increasingly concerned that the social movements and areas of focus, tactics and programs developed in the 20th century to advance gender equality were of limited purchase in this new world. Grand Cold War narratives about society seemed to give way to a world increasingly decided on free market principles, based on econometric models of policy applications that yield quantified comparison. Broadly speaking, this approach separated economies from the social and political systems in which they were embedded. A common refrain from free market theorists held that maximal, if not perfect, competition would produce the best possible outcomes for consumers and for society. Competition in the service of a well-functioning market economy was therefore believed to require efficiency much more than equity. Where it was noticed at all, gender inequality was increasingly considered as a result of pre-labour market discriminations, connected, say, with women's care responsibilities, human capital differences in education, or women's self-selection out of particular areas of the economy. But then something happened. In the first decades of the 21st century, particularly leading up to the advent of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, the topic of gender equality became quite suddenly a fairly urgent priority of some of the world's most powerful market actors. Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, Credit Suisse, BCG, among many others, began producing major studies attesting to the ways that advancing women's economic interests can be a source of fast growth in emerging markets, and for firms in more developed markets, a competitive advantage and a source of innovation. The newly enlightened market consensus is that what's good for women is good for the market. Okay. Ergo, connecting women to markets is both to enhance women's socioeconomic situations and enhance the competitiveness and efficiencies of markets. It's a new way of thinking through this problem. This new growth model suggests the future is better and wealthier than today because women will be more financially active, run bigger businesses, access more capital. This sort of thinking has been impactful in some procurement circles. For example, International Trade Centre launched in December 2015 a platform called She Trades. This is a platform that you can download onto your mobile phone or use through the computer, aimed to connect 1 million women entrepreneurs to market by providing a platform for women entrepreneurs to connect. She Trades helps companies to include more women entrepreneurs in their supply chains as part of diversity and inclusion commitments, and enables women entrepreneurs to let the market know what their companies have to offer. There are countless other initiatives, experiments, attempts, good faith undertakings by different actors in the public and private sectors to enact this newfound belief that connecting women to markets is in all of our interests. And I think Martin's going to speak to a few of those examples from Germany after me. But to ask a banal question, will it work? Now that women have been discovered, can they be plugged into existing econometric models and the associated theoretical frameworks? Let's try and see. For the sake of argument, let's start with a simple periodisation of time, starting with the SDGs in 2015. Now, you all know that the SDGs expire in 2030. There's a set of targets and goals and sub-indicators. Let's try, just for the sake of today, to imagine what a good economic history of these 15 years, written in about 2030, might look like, or what it might include, rather. Of course, we should expect the standard elements of an economic history, explanations that include institutions, businesses, labour regimes, governments, political parties. We know these things are going to be important. Attention may also be paid to increasing labour-saving technologies, climate change, other externalities. Also included, however, would be the underlying behaviour of the market, the nature of what happened, the nature of the market and other vital parts of the economy. How much reference do you expect to see made to the unobservable conditions of perfect competition that orthodox economics still uses as an integral part of their methods? Would the history books suggest that, at the end of 2030, markets work? And if so, for whom? It's of course hard to say. But the history would have to include reference to some of the factors already discussed in this conference, some of these suddenly urgent challenges to some of the market orthodoxies that sort of emerged out of Bretton Woods and stayed constant. The global financial crisis of 2008, Brexit in 2016, or the referendum at least, the presidency of Donald Trump from early 2017, these events, among others, are likely to dominate popular memories of the 2020s. And as discussed by previous speakers, these events may be expected to negatively influence beliefs in the reliability of free markets, as did the Great Depression of the 1930s, for example. We yesterday heard talks about increasing protectionism and binational strategies. Given the current consensus that what's good for women is good for the market, a plausible history to 2030 would also include discussion of what gender inequality meant for market outcomes during this period. And I'm going to suggest that unless something quite radical shifts, I'll predict that women's economic outlook in 2030 will look a lot like 2015, which looked a lot like 2000. That is, women are in work and in business, but they are on average doing nowhere near as well as men. This is not because of laws necessarily that discriminate against them. It's not for lack of educational opportunities in most instances. Instead, a good economic history would show that women and men held different ideas about the reliability of free markets and beliefs about competition in the first place, and that affected what happened next. Free trade is predicated on market competition. Competition is the foundation for good procurement practice. But competition may not work for women, or at least not in the ways it's supposed to. When we see supply chains full of men-led businesses, employing mainly men, systemically underpaying women, the story currently is not that procurement has failed. So long as procurement standards and principles were applied appropriately, then according to many perspectives, the procurement processes can be considered successful. If gender is discussed at all, explanations for the gaps in men's and women's success winning contracts under procurement will point to a difference between men and women in, say, sectoral experience, ambition, access to credit, differing material self-interest. There's many examples that are trotted out. Procurement rules are the rules, and they are gender neutral. There does seem to be still little appetite amongst some procurement professionals to note that the reality may be the obverse. That gender-blind sets of procurement decisions focused on competition, but not on fairness, may contribute to women's systemic exclusion from economic opportunity. That the market is already distorted, but by gender. Let me quickly explain. Basic assumptions underlying support, I'll go back actually. Basic assumptions underlying support for free markets and ideas about competition are in many ways wrong. More specifically, the assumption that labour is mobile and that people are willing to compete openly, that they believe they can get rewarded for hard work and ability, applies well to one gender, but not so well to the other. Recent research by a colleague at EBRD, economist Michelle Brock, argues that strong links exist between inequality of opportunity and the views about the underlying processes that support economic success or failure. She also found that men and women have different views about the underlying processes, and I'll explain. But this finding sits alongside a growing literature on gender differences in taste for competition. A raft of literature has emerged in the last 10 years, suggesting that women display less affinity for competition. In tournaments, bargaining situations and auctions, studies have also shown that women are less likely to choose workplace settings where compensation is based on competition. Women are also less likely to agree to run in competitive elections, even though men and women are equally likely to volunteer to serve as unelected representatives. So it's not that they're shirking responsibility or ambition, they just don't want to compete in the elections. In ultimatum games, women are more likely to accept lower offers than men. And even among professional economists, who collectively have a very positive view of market competition, women are less supportive on average of such competition than men economists. Female economists tend to prefer government intervention to address economic problems more than their male counterparts, who tend to favour market solutions. This aversion to competition is consistent with a meta-analysis of more than 150 studies indicating that women are more risk-averse than men, even when taking risks would advantage them. At EBRD, we certainly see examples of this in our Women in Business program, where women-led SMEs commonly seek lower level loans, less amounts of borrowing than equivalent men-led SMEs, and therefore inadvertently put growth constraints on their own businesses. In some of the companies we support, we see that women are less likely to apply for training opportunities or even apply for promotion. Of course, some explanations offered for women attaching less value to competition than men suggest they innately prefer or are socialised to prefer a cooperative approach to life. I'm not sure, but I anyway think we need to look further. Put simply, my argument today is that if women do not believe that competition is fair, that they can get rewarded for hard work and ability in the same way that men can, then there is little incentive for them to buy into the system. For example, by building skills or building a business or by bidding for contracts. Different choices are made depending on whether you believe the system is unfair or whether you believe that effort is rewarded. Men are much more likely to believe that effort is rewarded. Women are much more likely to believe that the system is unfair and self-select out of competition that they consider to be already rigged. This matters for women, but this also matters for procurement. Much of life in democratic political systems derives from the notion that competition is a positive force in society. Competition remains endemic to both our economic and political systems. To the extent that competitive systems do not mirror women's values and preferences as well as men's, well, this suggests a fundamental disjuncture which we would all do well to think about. If women are far less likely than men to behave in ways that correspond to the assumptions of our political and economic models, the predictions of these models will likely be incorrect for roughly half the population. This matters for growth models, but it also matters for society. After 25 years investing to drive transition to market economies, EBRD has found that the failure to share more evenly by gender the costs and opportunities of the transition process has presented cost and risk to some of our countries of operation for 3 reasons. One, of course, a major part of skilled and well-educated human resource lies untapped in a country if women aren't well connected. But 2 and 3 are the more important for today's talk. 2, the legitimacy of the market and political system can itself be questioned on the grounds of inequality. People aren't going to buy in to the new market economy visions, new political processes and visions if they don't feel that there's a fair process underpinning their ability to participate. And 3, inequality of opportunity may have strong spillover effects on social cohesion and stability and contribute to rising populism. And we can talk about examples if we have time later. But we at EBRD recognise that fair and equitable access for competitors is what's important, and that special attention needs to be paid to women to ensure fair and equitable competition, not just competition. To the extent that women are less likely than men to behave in a manner consistent with assumptions about free markets and fair competition, there may be some urgent lessons for people involved in gender-neutral business processes such as procurement. I would argue that procurement has to go beyond what has by now become the standard for being unbiased. Procurers must not only make their own procedures and staff gender neutral, that is, have women throughout the system in decision-making processes, but they also must respond to the factors that influence who enters the gender-neutral system in the first place and who does not. Procurement policies have to acknowledge how women engage with the market economy, in particular that they do not much like or trust competition and may have different beliefs about fairness after experiencing a pretty unfair rigged system across time and generations. Procurement policies have to acknowledge how formal and informal institutions and processes may make women less viable contractors, not because they are not qualified, but because they face different constraints. And our systems may not have factored in the constraints that prevent some partners from even arriving at the start of the market. To ensure free and fair competition, these 2 factors need to be considered. These are the future of real gender-neutral decision-making and fairer competition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move on directly to the next speaker, Martin Burgi. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Can I have the presenter? Can you understand me, or should I take the microphone nearer? It's okay?
Yeah.
Fine. Oh, makes it. Oh, fine. Ladies and gentlemen, warm welcome from my side as well. You will face now the fascinating experience to hear a practitioner speaking on a rather theoretical issue and a university professor here speaking on practical examples and a concrete legal framework. What I mean is the legal framework of the new European law directives. I would firstly speak on what is gender procurement about, to create a kind of a definition, typical juridical approach. Then give you some practical examples of gender procurement as required or at least permitted in Germany. You should know that Germany is a 2 sides country. The first part is a highly elaborated procurement market with highly specified law people. For a couple of years we have now a specific specialization among practicing lawyers, so you can be a specialist lawyer in the field of public procurement law. since that time we have so many legal remedies, procedures and all is challenged and so on. This is one part of the system. The other part is that we have a long tradition of promoting social and environmental aspects with a strong political desire to do so. And the relevant level for this is not the federal level, and it's not a policy driven by our chancellor, which was appointed yesterday as leading a woman in Europe. So I don't need to have to speak on gender procurement, because if the leading person is a female person, so you don't have to speak on gender procurement. No, this is not the whole game. The other part of the game is that Germany is divided in several Länder, the countries, and there is the legal competence to create provisions on environmental and social aspects, and more than 50 or 60% of these countries are governed by the Socialists and the Green Party, and they are keen on promoting social and environmental policy. So I can give you a lot of, perhaps for you, interesting examples. And if you may decide if they are worthy to adopt in your countries or in your jurisdictions, you should know which are the legal constraints to do so. And this is the third part when we deal with the European public procurement directives, which give more new answers to the question, what about gender procurement? First of all, a definition. Gender procurement involves the introduction of gender equality requirements in public procurement in order to use these as an instrument to advance gender equality. It's not my definition, it stems from the European Institute for Gender Equality. Thank you. It would be helpful to distinguish between requirements which firstly directly promote gender equality and non-discrimination. Example is the requirement of a certain share of women among employees or in the boards of the enterprise. And on the other hand, we see requirements which indirectly promote their goals. For example, if you require measures for the balancing of family and work. This belongs to the gender topic as well, but it's not as close to the core of this topic than the first category of measures. So, in the first step, we had a broad functional understanding, as I spoke, from instruments. Now we have to go more in the details and link this with the four stages of a procurement procedure in Europe. The first is the contract announcement, the technical specifications. The second are the grounds for exclusion and the selection criteria. The third stage is the award criteria, and the last one, and most important in the gender topic, are the contract performance conditions. And I would like to give you now some examples from the German legal practice linked to each of these stages. As I've earlier said, you don't find this all over in Germany, but only in some Länders. For example, most of them are Berlin, Brandenburg, North Rhine-Westphalia, Schleswig-Holstein, which is very northern, and Thüringen. Let's start with some concrete examples. For example, an example from Berlin, where actually is an intense debate on requested supplies when you have to create a new building or renovate an existing building. You have to equip this building with restrooms, and the topic here is require that these restrooms have additional gender-neutral restrooms. This is another part of the larger topic, gender procurements. A second example for the stage of the technical specifications is this one. Again, an example of Berlin. When I say Berlin, I don't mean the capital city. I mean the country Berlin and Brandenburg, which is a part of itself as it probably the region of Roma is in Italy. This example concerns the public advertising space, which is available for concessions. Typically, the local government gives the concession for using a space on public advertising, and they in Berlin require that there is no advertising used which reduces women or men, typically women, to sexual object, like in this example. The stage of the grounds for exclusion, this means exclusion is a sanction for former breaches of legal obligations, for example, in the field of social and labor law. And there's a lot of existing social and labor law which deals with gender issues, especially equal treatment in employment. And if an enterprise has violated such obligations in a former contract, this can be an exclusion ground in the next procedure for a new and a future contract. Let's move to the award criteria stage. Now we come nearer and nearer to this, what Philip has reported about. In example of Brandenburg here, taking account of the share of women among the employees, well-qualified employees, of tenderers, when determining the most economically advantageous tender. To highlight this, give you the concrete legal provision, section 4 of this regulation. They say preferred tenderers are those who are committed to the promotion of equality of women and men at work, and then first have a higher share of women among their employees, including trainees. Is that what you spoke on? And second, a higher share of women in management and executive positions. And then, section 10, the procedure. Contracting authority parameterizes, number 1, the share of women among the employees, the share of the gross salary of female employees. So this is one point among others in the decision which is the most economically advantageous tender, and it's on the same level than the price, for example, maybe with 10 or 20%. This is not possible since 2016. These are provisions stemming from 2010-2011. Because since that time it's not allowed to do this as a mandatory award criteria, but it is still practiced and possible to do it as a contract performance condition. And therefore this stage of the procurement procedure, the stage of contract performance conditions in the sense of Article 70 of the Directive 2014-24 is the most important stage now. And now probably the highlight of my speech, because I was not involved in this, I speak with a distance about the topic as a scientist should normally do. You find here this section 13 of the Act on the Promotion of Equality of Women and Men at Work of the state Berlin. It takes me 3 slides to present this single provision, because this is only the first part of the provision, starting up with this sentence: obligations for contractors to take first measures for the promotion of women, second for the reconciliation of work and family life, and then they start with number 1 until 8. We can't take into account all these provisions in the short time we have. But for example, number 2, binding targets with regard to increasing the representation of women on all job levels, or continuing from 9 to 15. Another example given, 9, participating in recognized measures and initiatives which aim at inspiring young women for male-dominated jobs, for example, in works, construction contracts. Interesting as well, number 14, offering of flexible working hours, and 15, offering of alternating teleworking. And now the last of these slides. We are still in the same provision. 16, possibility of part-time work on a fixed-term basis with an option to return to full-time. 17, for employees on parental leave. Some of them are with us, if I see it right. The possibilities of keeping in touch with professional life, training possibilities, and covering for other staff who are on vacation or sick. This seems to be very, very burdensome, but the good news is that the bidders or the tenderers are only required to fulfill 3 of these 21 requirements, and only if they are larger than typically 500 employees. So this is section 3 of this act. Enterprises with more than 500 employees have to choose 3 of the measures pursuant to section 2. So you can select 3 of the measures I demonstrated you, and at least one must be among the strongest 1 to 6. Then it's differentiated according to the size of the enterprise. Okay, these are the existing examples. These are not political programs. These are existing and binding laws, on the one hand. On the other hand, they are from an area before the directive 2014. I would say these are provisions promoting gender procurement of a first generation. And the current debate is that these provisions have to be adopted to the new European legal framework, which is more open-minded to social and environmental issues than the former legal framework. Now we call it in Europe strategic use of public procurement. It is no longer seen as something dangerous or something which should be avoided on every price. Today it is seen as a normal part of the system, but with 2 major and very important limitations which have to be taken into account. The first one is there's always been a sufficient link to the subject matter of the contract. And the second one is the principle of proportionality. It's a little bit ironically, because this is a typical principle of the German judicial tradition, the principle of proportionality, and now it's a limitation for measures taken into place in German Länder, as we will see on the next slides. To sum up with this slide, I would say the new approach should be a more balanced one, not the moving ahead, devastating the existing field of these first generation provisions, but take a more balanced and a more differentiated approach. What does this mean for the several examples and stages? First, again, the technical specifications. You remember the requirement with the restrooms. This is surely fully compatible with European Union law because it's the stage before procurement. It's the stage when you define what do you want to buy, and on this stage you are free. More problematic is the requirement relating to the non-discriminatory perception of the subject matter, because there is no obvious link between the space for advertisement on a road, or nearby a road, on the one hand, and on the other hand, on the content of these specific kind of advertisement. So we say it's doubtful, this means there is no no legal case concerning this issue. In my personal opinion, this could be accepted because we speak on public space for public advertise. And this is a difference. There's a certain when the local municipality offers the space for advertising, it's in a role of to make it better than the others do. And if they decide that we use the road to create a new sense for gender issues, this can be politically debated, and it's not my point to promote for this. But if there is a majority in the political community of this local government, then this should not be seen as a violation of public procurement law. But we can discuss about this. I skip this slide for time reasons and go further with the grounds for exclusion and the selection criteria. First, the exclusion grounds. Here the result is short and simple. The directive says explicitly that if applicable obligations in the field of social and labor law, including obligations concerning, for example, equal payment, are violated in the past, this leads now to an exclusion ground, so there is no problem at all with this topic. Completely different is the stage of selection criteria, because they relate only to suitability, to economic and financial standing, and to technical and professional ability. And you see no link, no connects between the professional ability or the financial standing and the gender. At the end of a long gender debate, we can't say today that there is a link between the financial standing or the professional ability and the gender. This wouldn't make any sense here. So you can't use the selection criteria stage to promote gender procurement. The most important stage for doing so is the contract award criteria stage, and much more important, as already said before, the contract performance conditions stadium. And here are a lot of the restrictions of the European law are not so strict than in the former stages. We have two requirements: sufficient link to the subject matter of the contract and proportionality. And when we go back to the examples, we see now that in principle, award criteria and binding requirements with the aim of incentivizing or demanding measures for the promotion of women and for the reconciliation of work and family life seem to be in line with the directive if, and now this is the most important point, you should always remember when you go home from Rome and think back to this speech, they have to be related to the persons assigned to performing the contract. This is the new approach of the 2014 directives. It has to be focused on the persons performing the contract and not for the persons working anywhere else in this enterprise. We find this explicitly, and I would like to quote this directly from recital 97 of the Directive 2014-24. There the European Union says, however, the condition of a link with the subject matter of the contract excludes criteria and conditions relating to general corporate policy. So it's not allowed to relate to general corporate policy, which cannot be considered as a factor characterizing the specific process of production or provision of the purchased works, supplies, or services. So you cannot require a certain general corporate social responsibility, but only focus on the persons assigned to performing the contract. This is a very important result. So a lot of the requirements in this huge Berlin catalog, we saw a couple of slides ago, a lot of these provisions are not in conformity with the new legal restraints because they go further. They focus on the board of the enterprise, they focus on the general corporate policy and so on. And if you plan on an international level to promote more gender in procurement, you should, in my opinion, take these European experiences in account from the very beginning and start and focus on these persons and these conditions which are in the contract and during the time of the contract. And if you do so, you can give a highly appreciated contribution to promote gender procurement. So, to sum up at this point, in the future, in the highly politically sophisticated and elaborated European countries, the track will be not less gender procurement, but a more balanced one approach for the future, and it is not recommendable to adopt these first generations tools. So I demonstrated you these tools because some of them are perhaps interesting and there's a lot of juridical work behind it, so you may profit from this or may have a benefit from it, but take into account that the focus should be on the persons and the infrastructure directly linked with the subject matter of the contract given. Thank you at this point.
Thank you very much. Two very interesting presentations, and I am going to open the floor directly to see if we have any people who are awake in the morning and very keen to ask questions. Gustavo. So do we have the microphone is coming from behind, yeah?
Okay, I have many questions, and I'm very confused, and so these are the reason for my many questions, but I will ask only one. If I have more time, maybe I can come back. I wanted to ask an opinion to Martin related, if I were to start with the view of gender procurement that Philip has put on the floor at the beginning with his presentation. After listening, would I sum up well your presentation, or would I be wrong in saying that in Germany, because of the EU Directive 2014, if I adopt his view, so I give you a moral code for judging my question, would you say that there has been a step backward with the EU Directive in Germany compared to the situation before in promoting gender through procurement? I hope I've been clear enough. Thank you.
Why don't we respond directly? I think we'll take the next question after.
On the political level, it would be a step back for those countries within Germany who had started earlier with these kind of very ambitious tools and instruments I demonstrated you on the political level. On the legal level, it would be a benefit for these lender and for all the other ones, because it is the first time that we can restrict discrimination and bureaucracy, because these are the two main challenges of promoting gender procurement in the way I demonstrated you in these former generation provisions. Because the first topic, discrimination, it is normally easier to fulfill such ambitious requirements for enterprises who are nearby the regions, who know the details, who know the circumstances, who know how the people in the procuring agency is thinking about, and so on. For enterprises from outside, it's more difficult to adopt this approach, even if they try the next week to get a contract somewhere else where probably other circumstances are relevant. This is the discrimination topic, and the second topic is bureaucracy. Probably most of you think that in Germany there is a so strong and large and highly qualified public administration that they is able to control, to assess, and to evaluate all these requirements. But this is not the case. So it is easy to write down 21 requirements in an act or a regulation, but it is much more difficult to assess this and to control it in every single procurement procedure. And there's a gap between the provision and its execution. And therefore, it makes sense to go a step back on the legal level, to be more realistic, to be more honest at the same time. And the result are the, in my opinion, very comprehensive and balanced new European directives ruling with these two requirements, proportionality and linked to the subject matter of the contract.
Ari?
Yeah. 1, 2? Yes. One question for Philip and one question for Martin. I mean, it's a fascinating topic to discuss, and of course it's linked with the methodology, I think, of the discussion in the context of procurement will be also continued in the next panels. But first to Philip, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understood your presentation, it's predicated on an understanding of the model, men are from Mars and women are from Venus, right? I don't know whether this counts at all, but I've met in my life, personal life, professional life, sports life, a lot of women from Mars as well. And in fact, I bear some scars from, so I'm not sure that this, assumption or the basis is I don't know whether I share it, but then again, you have empirical evidence that I don't. Based on this assumption, I wonder whether your proposition is to change, in the context of procurement, to change to change the paradigm of competition that undermines and, if you want, informs the basis, the structure of procurement regulation, and give through, I don't know, affirmative action type of provisions or policies greater margin for the Venus sort of inhabitants, as it were, or whether you propose for a fundamental radical change of the model upon which procurement regulation and policy is based, which is to move away from competition more towards a more cooperative involved model. That's my question to Philip. And the question to Martin is the following. If we agree that there is a need to, to put forward policies that they try to rebalance or create a level playing field, gender level playing field, don't you think that this obsession with the requirement of the link to the subject matter of the contract undermines completely the overall potential impact that such a policy could have through the use of procurement? Because if I were trying to think, economic analysis, if I am a Martian sort of male owner of a company that participates in procurement, and I want to win a contract that gives this, if you want, added points to me if I employ more women, I will do that. But I will not do that to the next contract that does not include that. So what would be the impact of the policy other than perhaps increasing the price if there is a price sort of element to that? I think, and if I understood correctly, is linked with the question that Gustavo asked before. Thank you.
Philip?
Thank you. I detect two questions in that, but the first, no, I'm not advocating that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. I firmly believe that both men and women are from Earth. And, however, they don't necessarily get treated as though they're from the same background, with the same rights, the same ambitions, the same levels of ambition. So whilst women and men are from Earth, the market, by the time they arrive at market, they've come to expect different things from it. And the empirical studies I referred to, and many, many, many more, suggest that women aren't trusting in the free and fair functioning of competition as men are. And as I said, there are some skeptics who suggest this is somehow tied to biology, or somehow tied to the fact that they're from Venus and men are from Mars. They're fundamentally different types of people. I don't buy into that at all. I think that there is an intergenerational legacy where women grow up without the role models in business and society, where they see women competing with equally qualified men and winning on a 50-50 chance. They know from an early age that men are much more likely to dominate political business spheres, the higher growth, higher value, higher salary parts of the economy, and take this on pretty profoundly according to the studies. And so, whilst they're both from Earth, they end up acting quite differently around market opportunities. And it's necessary that we reflect on that. Which gets me to the second part of your question, which was, what's my proposal? Whether quotas or affirmative action should be considered, whether cooperative models should be considered. Well, I didn't produce a proposal, and that was deliberate. One is because I'm not sure I've got anything concrete to offer. But the second is knowing that Martin's speech was after mine, and he goes through 21 options, plus how they've been updated and modified to both take a step forward and a step backward. In a way, the update on the 2014 regulation was a lighter touch, but what you've suggested is it's maybe more reality-based and more likely thus to have impact. This is where my talk ends, and practitioner-based experiments, initiatives are taking off. I'm certainly not advocating for quotas or for affirmative action, nor am I advocating for a tearing up of basic econometric thinking and models upon which they're based. I am instead advocating that we consider carefully the ways in which the market is distorted, and whether and how, in our functions as procurement professionals, we can accommodate that understanding. Before handing over to Martin, I'll just give the example. One of the points that was on Martin's slide was a category of exclusion based on non-compliance with laws around non-discrimination. And I guess some of you have been in procurement for very, very, very long time. And I hazard to guess that you've never come across an exclusion in your entire careers across all the people in this room for a company that systemically underpays women. And yet we know this happens. In all of the EBRD's countries of operation, there is a gender wage gap which can't be explained away through all the other variables. Even once all the other factors are put into the model, we see that companies get away with offering women lower salaries. They bid low on the proviso that some of the work can be done cheaply by exploiting women. In Switzerland, in the last couple of years, they've brought in a certification process where, to be eligible for public procurement, you have to certify that you are an equal pay for equal work company. And it's really just a matter of signing a document, but then being held to account on the chance that there will be a random audit of your HR data. and you have to have a plus or minus 5% variable against men and women employees doing the same job under the same conditions with the same qualifications, that sort of thing. This is one way of sending a moral signal to the market that gender equality matters, that procurement is a process in the designing of the in the specifications of who can even bid for public works or public procurement. The signal is sent that it matters to the Swiss government that you abide by our laws about gender equality. And these small steps, you know, it seems to be working quite well in their environment, and it's been adapted by a couple of private sector operators in Switzerland. But I'm trying to say, instead of a large, even though my talk was deliberately at a large kind of macro level, enhancements, improvements, change in the way in which women and men are able to benefit from opportunities connected with public procurement are going to come through the incremental, smaller stuff. Some of it will work, some of it won't, but I think just bringing it to the discussion is useful. It's where my contribution kind of ends and your contribution begins, I think.
Martin?
Yeah, let me go back to the question of Faris, who spoke on a gender level playing field. Christopher McRudden would speak from buying gender equality, so there are different perspectives on the same topic, which is interesting itself. You fear that the focus on subject matter of the contract would cut down a lot of political ambition in this topic. Maybe this is a political question because it's a legal decision. It was a legal decision of the parliament of the most member states to make it in this way. But we should not underrate the existing power of public purchasing. For example, if you require this provision, in one member state, on each level, federal level, country level, municipality level, you have more than, in Germany you would have more than 3,000 or 4,000 public purchasers who would then be obliged to do so. And your example of a postal service enterprise, when I understood you right, or let's take a postal service tenderer who is for whose it's very important to get public contracts, who can only exist with public contracts. He will adopt these requirements because otherwise he will disappear from the market. So it won't happen today, next week, or maybe next year, but it will happen on a long-term perspective. If you are not if it's too long for you, you should fight for a new ruling. But in the current political situation given on the European level, I don't suppose that we see new directives with more social and environmental policies than we have at the moment. So we should be lucky to have them and to work for make them applicable in daily life procurement in the years to come.
Thank you very much. So, we have another question from the audience.
I had intended to ask one question, but I'll add another one, if I may, in light of Martin's response. So, the first question was that the European Union seems to be pushing states essentially to use the contract performance stage quite heavily. So it's easier to use it at that stage than it is at the other stages. And that seems, an incentive to use contract performance rather than award criteria or whatever. And I'm wondering whether that's problematic, that incentive. Because I think all the studies that I've seen certainly indicate that the contract performance stage is the most under-monitored, most under-enforced stage of all of the stages in public contracting. It's the stage where essentially those who are involved in awarding the contract mostly bow out and don't really monitor. So the question is, are states being pushed to adopt the stage that's least effective? That's the first question. The second question is responding to your the question from Ari. So you'll be familiar with this question, but I'll ask it anyway. So can gender equality itself be the subject matter of the contract? That is, we've been talking around the question about linkages to the subject matter, but we haven't actually identified what the subject matter of the contract itself can be. And we think of the contract, essentially the subject matter, as being buying widgets or buying services or whatever. Why can't the social objective itself be the subject matter of the contract? And if that's the case, then doesn't that really address all of Ari's concerns, because the public authority then makes gender equality itself part of the subject matter?
Thank you. Martin or Philip? Martin,
Two sophisticated and contradictory questions. Because the answer to the second question would be, let's stop in promoting gender in procurement. And the answer to the first would be, let's do more than before. Let me start with the second one. From a very clear and strict, rather competition-driven standpoint, you could indeed say that gender and social aspects on a whole have nothing to do with the subject matter of the contract. But we are in a political debate, and there are some margins, there are some discretions, and it was a very long and intense political debate on the European level. I had the honor to being involved in these debates as a consultant of the German government during the directives process in 2014, and I'm fascinated until today how competent, how ambitious and how intense these debates were. And in my opinion, it was the whole procedure on creating the new directives was we would say a moment of Europe was on the highest level of appreciation, in my personal appreciation in this period, because normally we think Europe is a cold and bureaucratic machine. There is no politics inside, there is no parliamentarism inside, but this is not true. Alone to this topic were more than 2,000 amendments during the debates in the European Parliament, which is very, very impressive. And what the deputies there, what they spoke, what they brought in on new input is much more impressive than the most inputs I have ever seen in the parliaments of German countries, for example, including the Bavarian parliament, but don't tell this when I'm flying home. Back to your question. This political decision was to enlarge it a little bit farther from the very strict approach, no subject matter. And this enlargement is linked to the subject matter. So it's not the subject matter itself, it must be linked with this is a softer and a little bit enlarging approach. We can discuss about it, but this is the result of a political process, and it seems to me this is still acceptable. So let me go back to the first question. You are completely right that the stage of contract performance condition is until now, or has been, the most under-monitored stage. Maybe this is the reason why we put all in this stage. I'm not sure. The advantage of putting it on this stage is that there is less impact on competition and on qualitative and price-oriented selection. Because on the selection and on the award stage, you have all these topics outside. You compare tenderers with their price, with their quality, with all what is directly the subject matter of the contract. And then you say, okay, this one is the best in terms of quality and price. You give him the contract. And then the game starts from the beginning. All your tenderers have subscribed a declaration that they would like to accept these conditions if they get the contract. Now, they have the contract and they have to accept. And our task is it, probably not so much a task of procurement law, more a task for contract law. Maybe in the US you have a specific public contracts law, government contract law it's called. We don't have it in most countries in Europe. In Germany we use the normal private law rules for this. But the private rule laws know damages, they know termination of a contract, and it's a task for the future, for all of us here, for the lawyers, to make these instruments stronger in order to avoid what you said, that it's the most under-monitored stage. This is not naturally given. We can change this by political or administrative activities.
I think we can take one more question because we are running into coffee break time. So last question.
Yeah, thank you. So the last question was to follow up on what Philip Martin was saying about the gender salary gap. And I remember in class we spoke a lot about that. Also the Switzerland new legislation. And as far as I remember, that was mainly for public procurement of goods. So gender gap in firms dealing with manufacturing. But what struck me most, I saw a recent report from 2015, was that gender gaps also happen in the highest level of service, so consultancy company. Consultancy company, gender gap can reach a percentage up to 20%. So the highest level of probably service can deal with this problem. And the question is, for both of the speakers, if I may, since the problem is so pervasive in our society, not just in manufacturing, but also in the service that probably everyone in this room has used, directly or indirectly once, how can we tackle this issue, which are the tools at our disposal to tackle them, or firearms to tackle them?
Thank you. Yep.
I will just answer quickly in the way EBRD tries to tackle these issues. Whether or not we're having enough success, time will tell, but it's consistent with some of the ideas that Martin put up in the first 21 suggestions, where whether it's a works or services contractor, especially if we know a client is going to use contractors for different functions of their business, we ask that they have in place a contracting condition that the supplier has an equal opportunities policy or plan in place which is consistent with national best practice. Increasingly we seek for those to be certified where that's possible, as it's consistent with national best practice. And then we have to hope and see what happens next. And it sounds like a bit of an evasive answer to a very direct question, but I don't want to be didactic and suggest that there is a particular silver bullet. And we've seen some of our partners and stakeholders really change the way in which they are delivering their services. PwC in Kazakhstan, who we work with as partners rather than as a client, but globally, PwC, I think, is about 60-65% of its annual intake of consultants are women, but by the time you get to partner stage, it's 10%. And PwC Kazakhstan has managed to have about 40% of their partners women, which is a global outlier for their business, just by again, attending to what they find is an appropriate model and an approach to them. We tend to find that with the commitment to equal opportunities as part of the contracting condition, and where necessary some sort of technical support to set up an equal opportunities committee internally, not externally, not downloading something from the internet, not reading the right book, but enough networked, smart, hard-working people, men and women who work in the business, who come at this problem and say, listen, are we happy to work in a company that systemically under-promotes women or underpays? No. And then so a kind of a motivation or a space is being created in the contracting, but it's up to the client to figure out what to do about it. As I said, it's a bit of a hands-off, hope and see, but so far that's returning some dividends.
Martin, any last comments? No? Okay. All right. I suggest that we give the speakers a big applause for this. Thank you very much. Very nice. If we could reduce the coffee break to 20 minutes, meaning let's try to be back here 11:30 and kick off the next session. Thank you very much.